So I just wanted to put together a video for you guys on the Discord. The easiest way to start with programming or periodization is ask yourself why. What is periodization or programming meant to do? And all it's meant to do is manage stress. Training is a stress, right? People like to say training relieves stress, but training is also a stress. You still release cortisol, you still release other stress hormones. So periodizing or programming is what allows us to kind of ebb and flow with the stress of the athlete over time. So maybe one block we're way up here and then other blocks we're down here because we have to accommodate. Or it's planned that we're doing this much volume and the next block we're slowly going to go down because intensity then climbs up, whereas before it was lower. Um, at the end of the day, though, like that's just a hypothetical example. In short, though, it's just about stress management. So back to the concept of stress management and why is it important? Or why is planning stress important? Okay. Anyone can go into the gym, especially at a new training age, and go, yeah, I got better. Doing what? And you can get any number of answers, and 9 out of 10 times they're not lying. They probably got better at something doing something entirely ridiculous because your body will adapt to a new stress relatively quickly. So you could have a beginner hump a doorknob with a barbell in his hands, and he's going to get stronger at benching. That's just kind of the reality of his training age. He's not used to the stress, so he could have the most minuscule program in terms of volume or intensity, and the next time he comes back in, he'll be slightly stronger. Very rare, but it can happen. Okay. So, why then should we plan programming? Why then should we consider it in the long term? Well, go on any internet forum and you'll find so many people are like, oh, I wish I listened to my body sooner. I wish I listened to my body. That's good advice, okay? But 9 out of 10 times, most people's body are going to tell them stop training because it's hard. Because your body's trying to say, no, don't do this because you're attacking our homeostasis. We don't want to adapt to training. We want things to be the same constantly, okay? That's just a fact. So people say, oh, I wish I listened to my body sooner. In some instances, it is true, and that's not even to get into the like neck of or the woods there of pain science and injury science because that is very convoluted and simple ideas of like, oh, this hurts, so I shouldn't do it, or this hurts, therefore this is bad, isn't really true. And I'm not saying auto-regulation isn't important, but if auto-regulation can't be everything. You can't auto-regulate the exercise you do. You can't auto-regulate the reps you do. You can't auto-regulate the intensities every single time you come in so that no matter what day you're on, it's always changing. At that point, you can never have a predictable platform for success. So that's why we write it down. That's why we plan it, because ideally, you change things slowly block to block. You don't change everything up because if you change everything up, just like in a science experiment, how do you know which variables actually changed and were meaningful and which ones weren't? You just changed 8 different things. You went to a different squat placement. You went to a different tempo of the squat. You added significantly more reps. Oh, but you also changed the accommodating resistance. So now you got bands and chains. But then the next week, the chains are set up differently and then it's a different percentage. There's just all these things that if you're not tracking it, there's no way to know what actually worked for you. So auto regulation is good. You just have to have some sort of plan to kind of follow along with. Okay. So that's just the short of why we would program out or why we would periodize. But to get into the kind of performance aspects of it, there's a concept of fitness to fatigue ratio. Okay. So time is our x axis, our y axis is going to be our fitness. And let's just look at it for a second as this. This is us just kind of casually about in our early training. And then we get to a higher, let's say I'm powerlifting. I'm a power lifter, so I'm going to say this person is powerlifting. Okay, heavier loads, maybe slightly higher volumes than you're used to. I wouldn't say that, but sometimes that does happen. But higher intensities or more lifts at higher intensities. And then we'll recover some right around that bottom before maybe we get injured. Okay, before we burn out, we'll start to deload. And then ideally, we swing back up because our body is saying, oh crap, we have to adapt to this load. So, whatever this load is, if we just call it X load, our body said at this point, okay, I can't really adapt to this yet. I can do it, but I can't adapt. So then we recover. But then after the recovery point, instead of returning to baseline, because we allowed ourselves to recover, Our body is still in variable X. We're still ready for variable X. But ideally, if we timed it right and we planned it right and everything was sound principally, we end up with some improvement. This would be a supercompensation or peak. This is coming out of stuff from the Soviets, specifically Berkshire, Soviet scientist, really important guy. I recommend looking him up. And I can spell that out on the Discord or anything that we need to. Um, but in short, it's these kind of performance jumps that we want. However, if you look at someone like Chad Wesley Smith, he's discussed that he only ever sees 1 to 2% improvements. Now, 1 to 2% can be incredibly small, but 1 to 2% on, say, an 800-pound deadlift can win you a meet and $10,000. Okay, so that can be a lot. It can also just be a lot of stress too, like a 40 pound jump. Like that's pretty big. Okay. With that said, when we're talking about the kind of timelines or stress management, one thing I would kind of look at, this is a good book, Block Periodization by Vladimir Shirin. And this is, they do a bunch of research in the book, so it's kind of a scientific background, but the basic idea is that you plan these progressions, these maybe 4 to 6 week blocks, sometimes 3, sometimes 2 week blocks, that you're looking to get a specific biological output. It's specifically for sports, so you're talking about different things like anaerobic endurance, speed, power, maximal strength, strength, speed, all these different things, right? You're planning them in little increments based off the residual effects of training. So at some point, ideally, you don't get to stay up here on the top of the mountain. At some point, you come back down slightly. And maybe you return to baseline because you didn't train well, or maybe you were slightly higher than baseline. So maybe now we're at like 0.02% better off than we were before. But if that was just a 4 month cycle and we string those together over a long period of time, those improvements add up. But we never stay at the super compensated or peaked condition the whole time. It's just not possible. So block periodization is kind of the way of planning those slight peaks in certain physical qualities. I will say though that there's other books, such as this one that I'm reading, Football Periodization. This guy is a strength and conditioning or fitness coach, whatever you want to call it. He worked at Manchester City, he worked for Wales, he worked for I believe Barcelona. He's worked for a lot of teams. And one thing he talks about is the fact that if the loading metrics are correct and like a slow burn effect, you can maintain roughly the same levels of fitness across 10 months. Fitness being specific in this book to football fitness is probably not true for other aspects or sports, but 90% is still pretty good to live the rest of your year on. Okay, so those are kind of reasons why you should plan out your progressions, why you should even consider programming in the first place. But if we step back from that kind of hodgepodge of words I just gave you, let's look at how, because I think most of you are more concerned with the how of how to do this. How exactly do I periodize? How exactly do I plan? Okay, so the kind of variables we want to look at first, we've got how. Considerations to be made before we even get into the how really need to be sport, needs, weaknesses. Individual, we'll call it T age for training age, needs, strengths, weaknesses. You need to ask those questions first because the programming is only good if it applies to an end goal or a context, right? That's why you should never look at someone's program without knowing why they're doing something like this is bad, okay? Especially with top level coaches. Like I've literally seen this before where powerlifters will put out their programs and people will be like, "This is a dog shit program," and that powerlifter I've known for a fact will have followed that program and still PR'd. And it's true that it might be dog shit, or it worked really well for that person because that coach that athlete had over that period of time was really in tune with these sorts of questions. Okay, so sport. Always ask that first, right? What do you need to be a soccer player? Drastically different than what you need to be for a powerlifter. What do you need to be for a powerlifter? Still different than what you need to be for an Olympic lifter, right? So there's those minute details that kind of go, what are the qualities I need to be considering over the long term? Okay, so if you're a powerlifter, maximal strength. If you're a weightlifter, an Olympic weightlifter, that's pretty obvious explosive power, right? There's never a power clean that anyone's grinded through. It's just not happening. If you're a soccer player, okay, now we've got a few different things. We kind of need to encompass some level of maximal strength, some level of anaerobic endurance, some level of aerobic endurance, some level of sprint speed, some level of power. Like there's so many different outputs that you actually have to be considering. But that's where you have to answer the question of needs, right? Because then the program looks different. I wouldn't lift my soccer players the same as I would my powerlifters. I might do powerlifting movements. I'm not gonna push them the same. Okay. Weaknesses. What are typical weaknesses that we find within this athlete's population? So powerlifters, okay, are going to have different set of weaknesses as a whole than soccer players. Soccer players going to have a lot of ACL injuries, a lot of non-contact injuries, a lot of hamstring and calf injuries. So those would be what I would call weaknesses. What those are concerns we have, not just for the individual athlete, but as a whole, the entirety of athletes who play that sport. Okay, so then we'll go into the individual. Okay, I've answered sport needs and weaknesses. Individuals, training age. No need to do some super complicated undulating periodization, west side conjugate, you know, band chained everything up if the guy's never trained before. Like it doesn't make sense. Let's do something more fundamental to his level to better build technique and movement quality and still get the same gains. Okay. Needs. This relates, needs, strengths, and weaknesses are all going to relate of the athlete back to their sport. What does this athlete need for their sport? And what I mean by that is it also ties into weakness. What are they weak at that they need to be good at for their sport? Okay. So, but weaknesses doesn't have to be a need. Powerlifters typically have crappy aerobic endurance. Is that a need or is that just a typical weakness? It's a typical weakness. I'm not saying aerobic endurance is a necessary facet of powerlifting to be better at it. You might want to consider it for longevity and personal health, but if we're peaking for a meet, yeah, that's out the back window. We're not putting that in. Okay? Strengths. What are they good at? Are those things capable of being refined for that specific sport? If you have a powerlifter, is this guy really good at maximal strength? Can he hit heavy singles really well? Can he take whatever his 5 RM is, the estimation, and do it for one? Can he take what should be 98% and hit it for a single? Those sorts of things. Does he have the necessary skill and technique involved to be a good powerlifter? Or let's say he's a soccer player. Is he really good at sprinting and we need to be concerned with maybe his hamstring strength because maybe he has the speed to hit really fast sprint speeds, but not the hamstring strength to deal with repeated sprints at that speed. That's a consideration to be had. Okay, so once we've answered those questions, which again, this is why I say powerlifting or any strength sport is going to be easier, there's really not a whole lot of complications because the training is the sport itself. Soccer is not the same. Soccer athletes don't get better at soccer because they're in the weight room. They get to be better athletes and hopefully that transitions. But if you just get to be stronger and faster, that doesn't mean your tactical IQ raises, which is incredibly important for the sport of soccer. So there's considerations within each sport that need to be had. But if we take it from a powerlifting perspective, there's really not that many. Okay. So then let's go into the actual how. What are my considerations? Volume, intensity, we'll say tempos, variations, and we'll say transferability. And we'll do transferability last because that ties in eventually. Okay. Those are our main two things anyone's ever really concerned about with programming. Everyone's always concerned reps and sets at what volume, what percentage, what am I doing? Okay. There's a few different ways to define volume and intensity individually or even describe the relationship. But in short, I'll make those another video. But for right now, we're just, all we need to know is these things are inverse. Okay. To some degree, they're inverse. Typically, as volume goes up, intensity needs to go down. If intensity goes up, typically volume needs to go down. But let's say you start at 3 sets of 8 at 60%. If I raise the volume to 3 sets of 10 per set, technically the intensity also raised on an intraset level. But it's such a low intensity still that we really don't need to be that concerned with it, as long as we're not doing this every single exercise, right? We started low enough that the slight incremental raise in volume isn't going to kill us intensity wise. I'll cut the video here in a second. But another consideration, tempos. What tempos are we using? What's the phase we're in, right? Are we doing eccentric lowers at say 5 seconds to get some sort of adaptation to help us with jumping and cutting? Or maybe bracing pattern? Those are all considerations that need to be made. But tempos, in my opinion, tie into intensity. You can't do the same rep range at the same percentage at a 5 second eccentric as you can do a regular eccentric. It's too much energy. Okay. Variations. Variations and transferability go together. Okay. And the reason I say that is this. We can pick any number of variations, right? If we're a bodybuilder, okay, cool. Then we can just pick whatever we want that has the best kind of angles for us to grow from, the best kind of fit. But if we're in powerlifting, we need to pick the variations that have the best transferability to our sport. And we need to pick variations that our athlete can handle. There's no point in doing a rear foot elevated split squat with a safety squat bar and chains if our athlete can't even do a single, split squat, feet equally on the ground and with a goblet, right? That doesn't make much sense. Take your time with your variations. That's another progression tool. Why go to the hardest thing first when we can stay with the easiest thing? But transferability, we want to look at someone like Anatoly Bondarchuk, who's a throws coach, who's written about transferability in exercise. And the kind of considerations we need to be concerned with here are joint angle specific to the sport and velocity specific to the sport. Okay, so that's why we have comp stance squat or comp squat, competition squat or competition bench, competition deadlift, because those things are the things we do in the sport. So they have the highest degree of transferability. If I got stronger at the back squat that I use in the meet that I do in training, I got stronger. That's just a fact. And I'll end it here.